Hello and welcome back. My name is Nathan House and I'm with the Church of Christ in Houston, California. And if you could like or subscribe to this video, that would be great. I want to talk today about spiritual growth. I want to begin by sharing this little bit of information. There is a physical condition called Rett syndrome. I have it on the screen, and it's a very sad condition. It affects primarily females. In this condition, you have a child who begins to regress, who begins to move backwards in their physical development. They may go from walking to not walking, from beginning to develop words to not. And this usually occurs when they're little. And this is a very sad conditioning. And again, it's called Rett syndrome, characterized by a lack or regression of physical development. And this is actually a slide from them. I added that physical lack of development. That's my insert on there. But this is their slide highlighting this situation. Very rare, and that's a good thing because it's a very sad situation. But what I want to talk about is, how many of us would be devastated if we had a child, and while we may all look at those moments and think, oh, how cute, I hope they never grow up. The truth is we all understand a child that does not grow, that does not mature, that does not develop. We all understand that's a serious problem. There's something seriously wrong. There's a developmental issue because we understand that as they mature, as they age, they should begin to do things differently. They should begin to think things differently, act differently, behave differently. And so when there's not a development, we understand that as a serious problem. And so as we think about this for a moment, growing up, what does it look like? What should it look like from a physical development? But for even a more important conversation is spiritually. What does it look like for us to develop spiritually? Biblically speaking, there's obviously a time where we're innocent. There's a time where we don't understand right from wrong. In the book of Deuteronomy, as Moses is talking to the Israelites prior to them going into the promised land, he speaks of their parents, actually, their parents' failure to trust, and he actually is recounting these events back to the next generation. And something he says interesting in Deuteronomy 139, he says, and as for your little ones, now he's actually speaking of those who were adults at the time because he's looking back, but as for your little ones, who you said would become a prey, and your children, watch this, who today have no knowledge of good or evil. So that's really what I want you to see here. Moses talks about a time in a life of a child where they don't have any knowledge of good or evil, right? That's an age of innocence. They don't understand right from wrong. And so the Apostle Paul, I think, even talks about this when he's writing in Romans chapter 7, verse 9. He talks about there was a time where he was apart from the law. Well, Paul was never apart from the law as far as an actual physical timeline, right? The law came, 1,000+ years before the Apostle Paul. So there was never a time where he was apart from the law, as far as just an actual timeline. But there was a time in Paul's life where he was a child. And when you're a child, you're innocent. Unfortunately, many people may not like this, in some religious groups, but you're innocent, you're sinless. You don't understand right from wrong. You don't understand good or evil. So Moses talks about this, and he says there was a time these people didn't understand it. But the truth of this is we cannot stay spiritually children. It is a sad thing when someone has been in the church for years and years and years and they don't mature. There's a lot of people grow older in the church, but a lot of them don't grow up. A lot of them don't mature. There's a lot of people who I have been around in my life who I've seen, and they've been Christians and they've been coming to church for years, but the maturation, the development, there sometimes is even regression. We cannot stay spiritual children. I'm going to throw some verses on the screen today, and we're going to look at a couple of verses today. And I'm not going to try to get into why the writer is specifically talking about the lack of maturity. I may quickly mention it, but I'm not trying to get off on that. I simply want to show that New Testament writers talk about the dangers of immaturity, of being spiritually immature, while highlighting and emphasizing the need to grow, the need to develop. So without getting off on why each writer is specifically addressing this, the overarching message is this: there is a call in New Testament writing by New Testament writers for people, for Christians, for churches to grow, to mature. So let's first of all toss this on the screen. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, the Apostle Paul says a lot in this writing to the church in Corinth about worldly versus physically, right? There's worldly wisdom, there's carnal living, right? Living for the flesh. There's living like a child. These are all things that are over on this side, if you will. On this side, he talks about godly wisdom, spiritually mature people, not being immature in your faith, not being immature in your understanding. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, notice what Paul says. Paul says, but I, brothers, could not address you as spiritual people. If you think about it for a second, what does a spiritual person look like? We have that very famous, the fruits of the Spirit. Should a spiritually mature person manifest the fruits of the Spirit? Should a spiritually mature person be, loving and self-controlled? Those 9 characteristics that are spelled out, should a spiritually mature person have those? But Paul says to the church in Corinth, I can't address you as spiritual people, but rather you're people of the flesh as infants. Again, we all love infants. They're super cute and all that, blah, 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 right? But the truth of the matter is you can't stay infants. You're a people of the flesh. You're not spiritual. You're infants. Paul says, I fed you with milk, right? So there was a time where somebody else had to feed them, and what they were being fed was milk. It wasn't solid food because you're not ready for it. And Paul says, this is a very sad thing to hear him say, even now you're not ready. Even now you're not ready. Why not? Because you're still of the flesh. So here, real quick microcosm, look at this. Why are they immature in this text? Because they are jealous, because they have jealousy and strife. There's division among them. So that's immature. You shouldn't be acting that way. Later on in 1 Corinthians 13, and again, we're not going to go there. You can look at that on your own later, but I have this on the screen. Later on in 1 Corinthians 13, as Paul is again dealing with some marks of immaturity amongst them, right? They're bickering over spiritual gifts, which ones are greater. But Paul also talks about how when the church was going to mature, when the church was going to grow, and he lists 3 specific spiritual gifts. He says they're going to pass away, right? Speaking in tongues, knowledge, understand. These things are going to pass away. Prophecy, they're going to pass away. So as the church matured, those were going to disappear. And so you can even see perhaps in that their immaturity is that they're highlighting these things that are temporary, right? Paul says love, chapter 13, verse 8, love never ends. These things are going to. But then he comes to verse 11, and this is what you have on the screen. Paul says this, when I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. You see, there is a progression that we are to follow. There is a progression that every person is to make from immaturity to maturity, from childhood to adulthood, from physical, carnal to spiritual, from feeding on milk to feeding on something else. Paul will then also say, and we're going to actually turn over to Ephesians chapter 4. So we're going to hop over to this text you see on the screen. Ephesians 4, verse 11. In talking about spiritual gifts again, he's talking about the spiritual gifts and the purpose, and talking about that Christ gave here in verse 11. Christ gave spiritual gifts, apostles, prophets, and the purpose of them was to equip the saints. And you see the purpose of that equipping. And in verse 13, you read this. Part of the purpose of the equipping of the saints was this, so that we can attain to the unity of the faith and the knowledge of the Son of Man, to mature manhood. You see, there is a progression we are supposed to make as Christians. We are supposed to grow. We are supposed to mature. Now, specifically here, he's talking about so that we're not led astray by false teachers, right? We're not led astray by those who are deceiving us, because we are grounded in the Word. He says, why should we do this? So that we may no longer be children tossed to and fro by the waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by human cunning, by craftiness or deceitful schemes. We're not supposed to be tossed around by these things. Rather, speaking the truth in love, look at this, we are to, look at this, grow up in every way. Grow up in every way. The sad fact is that there's just not enough, for most people, there's not enough serious study, serious time spent in the Word of God. And I'm always kind of cautious to say this because I sound like I feel like I'm being a jerk or being mean, and I don't want to do that. But a lot of people, they have these devotionals. I do my daily devotional. Their devotional consists of one verse and then a whole bunch of comments by whoever wrote that devotional. One verse. I'm not trying to be harsh here, but our Bible study, our time in the Word cannot be one verse. I mean, it's fine to spend some time in that one verse, but if you're only reading one verse a day, somebody called me the other day and said, if you're only reading one verse a day, it's going to take you 83 something years to read the whole Bible. Well, you don't have 83 years to read through the Bible, right? I mean, the point I'm trying to make is in Acts chapter 17, Luke is talking about the Jews who were in Thessalonica, the Jews who were in Berea. He says the Jews in Thessalonica, they weren't very noble, right? Well, why weren't they very noble? Because they didn't search the scriptures. Those in Berea, they were noble. It says they searched the scriptures daily to see whether these things were so. You see, we cannot be spiritually mature people if we aren't in the Word regularly. This is a plug for get into Bible classes with members of your congregation. Your church probably has Wednesday Bible classes, Sunday morning Bible classes. Go to those classes. Spend time in those classes. Don't let that be the only time you're in the Word. Get into the Word on your own, but go to those classes. Get into the Word on your own. Another text here. This will be the last one we actually look at. Hebrews chapter 5. He says, about this we have much to say, and it's hard to explain, since you have become dull of hearing. For though, look at this, by this time you ought to be teachers. How many people should be teachers now that simply aren't? He says, instead, you still need someone to teach you. You still need milk, right? This is what you need. Why? Why do they still need someone else to teach them? Why do they still need milk? When you're a baby, somebody else feeds you. But there comes a time where you feed yourself. Feed yourself. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with sitting at the foot of a great teacher. You should do that. You should listen to other teachers. But you need to be feeding yourself as well. And you need to be progressing from being a student to becoming a teacher. He says you ought to be teachers. But instead, you have to have someone teach you basic things. You need milk, not solid food. Everyone who lives on milk, watch what he says. You're unskilled in the word. You're a child. Solid food is for the mature, for those who have their powers of discernment trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil. Therefore, let us leave the elementary doctrine of Christ and go on to maturity. Training. Soldiers train. Athletes train. Christians need to train. I've said this a lot. I don't know if I stole this from somebody else or if I actually came up with this on my own. I don't know. I don't even care. But nothing spiritually good happens by accident. It doesn't. Spiritually good things don't happen by accident. Spiritually good things happen when you put effort into making them happen. You don't grow in the Word accidentally. You don't grow as a Christian accidentally. You grow when you put in the effort. This is this training, right? Their powers of discernment are trained. Why? Because they're constantly practicing to distinguish. Now, this takes us all the way back to our very first verse, Deuteronomy 1:39, right? Distinguishing good from evil, right? These children did not know good or evil. But we are trained to know good or evil. Therefore, let us leave these things and go on to maturity. See, it is a sad truth that a lot of people are spiritually not progressing, spiritually stuck in the past, spiritually immature. We need to be people that grow, that develop, that mature. God's plan is for us to grow. How sad it is when a parent watches a child regress and not develop. How sad is it for God when he watches us not growing, not developing, not doing these things that we need to do? Let's get into the Word. Let's be people that go on to maturity. You have a good day. God bless.